$150 over this.
All right, we're going live, so be careful.
All right.
Be
Very
careful
good.
what you say. We're not going to start. We're just going to.
Let's turn off our phones too.
All right, we're going live, so be careful.
So what are you doing? Saying no Hunter Biden moves at the moment?
I'm sorry. What did you say? Am I what?
I said, oh, so you're saying don't do anything that Hunter Biden would do on camera?
Basically.
I've got I joke around. I got a picture of me flipping off the guy taking the picture of me back when I was in construction long ago. And he joked with me, says, yeah, someday, man, I'm going to use this to bribe you or something. Or, I'm like, yeah, right.
I want to be able to get to the point where I've got a good thing to answer questions. By the way, hello everybody. By the way, Doug, your website, the SSL is not went down or something. So it's showing up as not secure. I don't know how you want to handle that, but just FYI.
Is it Douglas v. Gibbs or Political Pistachio?
Douglas v. Gibbs. When I went there to pull up the Constitution, it said you were. It said the site's not secure. Do you want to, proceed? It's not safe.
I wonder if I'm getting my own attacks.
So, no, that just has to do with the. That's just the SSL is no longer valid. You just need to update the SSL, or whoever's hosting the website has to update the SSL.
Came up no problem for me.
Are you the one hosting it, or?
Yeah.
So.
Well,
it's an easy
Yola hosts it, but I mean,
yeah, but if whoever's the hosting company, they're supposed to be responsible for that. So. We've got a few people in. Looks like we've got 60 watching. Wow, that's pretty good.
Considering the last minute notice.
Yeah. Well, I let everybody know. I let everybody know about an hour and a half ago.
Still last minute notice.
Yeah, still pretty good. Yeah, exactly. Hello, everybody. Hope you're well. I am feeling better, Joy. Thank you.
So you last week, me this week. Jeez Louise.
Yeah. Doug's not feeling too good today, but he's on the up. He's on the mend, so he decided he didn't want to push it off one more week. So last week, man, I was destroyed. I had that. I was under anesthesia, or I was coming to from anesthesia. I was so incoherent. I wouldn't have been able to function. I thought I could do it, but it just was not to be. You want to? We got 71 coming in. Let's. I think we're pretty good. You want to
get rolling?
Yeah, let's get going, man. We got time.
Yeah, it's 2 after. It's not like it's my live classes where we chat until about 5 or 10 after.
Yeah. If you guys have questions, if you guys have questions, by all means, put them in the chat, and I will do my best to get them to Doug. So excellent. Well, Mr. Gibbs, the one and only, take it away, sir.
Hey, everybody. Douglas v. Gibbs, Mr. Constitution here. And you can probably hear the nasaliness of my voice. Came down with something Saturday night, kind of a chest cold kind of thing. Been battling it all week, but I felt good enough to come on tonight. I'm not going to go out into public and frighten everybody, but The moment I start talking like this nasally in public, everybody else think I have COVID and run for cover. But we'll do this online thing today because we missed you last week, and I'm glad that you, Ron, are feeling better. And so, as we were traveling through our Constitution, now I want to know real quick if anybody's getting the same type of reaction to my website that Ron got. He tried to get into douglasvgibbs.com, and it gave him something about an SSL not being updated or expired. So if anybody wants to try that, and let them know in the chat, just so I can be positive that's what's going on, because I had no problem getting on the site. But then again, it's my site. Maybe it recognized me. I don't know. So let me know. But in your pocket Constitution or your other printed Constitution, or if you're able to get one online, we are in Article 6. Article 6 of the United States Constitution. And before I start reading, this is where the Supremacy Clause is. And this is, like the Commerce Clause and the General Welfare Clause, among the most abused clauses in the Constitution, misappropriated, misused. Then again, we know who we're dealing with. They misuse everything. Or as Scott would say, they're all forking criminals. Article 6, all debts contracted and engagements entered into before the adoption of this Constitution shall be as valid against the United States under this Constitution as under the Confederation. That first clause is just simply saying, regarding this new federal government, that the creation of the federal government doesn't change anything internationally. All of their debts with other countries, all of their agreements with other countries, all of their treaties, those still stand. This doesn't change a thing with anybody else. All it does is create a new government under this new Constitution for us here in the States. But when it comes to the country itself, its relationships with everybody is not changing. Now for the Supremacy Clause. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through three things here. Three items that are considered to be the supreme law of the land. The first one, this Constitution, comma, and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, semicolon, and all treaties made and which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. Now, the punctuation I mentioned is very important. When it comes to grammar, semicolons tend to separate things but yet keep them together. In other words, if you see a semicolon, it could stand as a separate sentence, but the semicolon is used to connect it with what came before it. So in this case, this Constitution, comma, and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof is its own sentence prior to that semicolon. This Constitution and the laws of the United States that shall be made in pursuance thereof. Pursuance thereof of what? The Constitution. So the Constitution itself is the supreme law of the land. And the any laws that are made that are pursuant, in other words, they're authorized to the federal government by the Constitution. Any laws of the United States that are not made pursuant to the Constitution are not supreme. So what I'm saying is any law that's made illegally outside the authority of the Constitution is not the supreme law of the land, should not be treated as such, and the states can ignore them because they're null and void. I'll give you an example, and all you libertarians are going to get excited now for a moment. There is not a single mention of drugs, marijuana, anything like that in the Constitution. The federal government has no authority over those things. Therefore, every single drug law by the federal government is unconstitutional. The states can decide what to do on that issue themselves. Now, I don't care where you stand on the issue. I don't care if you're into the recreational use, not recreational use, it should only be medicinal, whatever. I really don't care. I'm coming down to the legal part of this, the constitutional part. Constitutionally, when the state of California, for example, created its medical marijuana law and had the dispensaries, and then the federal government was bringing in the Alcohol, tobacco, firearms. That doesn't sound like the name of an agency. It sounds like a shop I'd like to visit. But anyway, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, they're raiding these dispensaries in California, and I was all up in arms. And people are like, oh, hey, Doug, I didn't know you're into smoking pot. I'm not. But from the constitutional part, I was for sure all over it because it was unconstitutional. Federal government had no authority whatsoever to be entering a state and then attacking and dismantling and taking the records of and shutting down a completely legal dispensary because California state law said it was legal. There is not a single federal, and here's what's funny about it. Back in the 20s, they had enough sense to realize they didn't have any authority over alcohol. So we saw the Amendment 18 on prohibition to restrict or actually eliminate the sales, transfer, or manufacturing of alcohol in the United States, prohibition. They had enough sense to pass an amendment for that, but they didn't figure out that they needed to for drugs. So from a constitutional standpoint, federal government has no authority over drugs. Therefore, any federal drug law is null and void. Therefore, a state can ignore those laws and have their own drug laws themselves. Now, whether or not that's good, bad, or in between on what the state decides, that's for you to determine. Okay, and that's Doug, for you to also try to regulate through your vote locally. Yes, sir.
Let me ask you. So where then do agencies like DEA come in? I mean, how?
It's an illegal agency.
Okay, so any agency that is brought in by the federal government to mandate things that the federal government can't mandate is essentially should be null and void.
Right. It shouldn't even exist. It's an illegal agency. It's a null and void, as Jefferson and Madison would say. Yeah. Now that said, do you think federal government should have that authority or some authority over these issues? I don't know. Perhaps. Depends. I don't think they should have authority over all of them, but maybe pharmaceutical. I don't know. But regardless of what they should, the fact is they don't. You want them to propose the amendment. Ask the states for permission. Remember, the states are the parents. And it takes 3/4 of the states to approve an amendment, to ratify an amendment. So when the Congress proposes an amendment, they are asking the states for permission to have that particular authority.
So when the states, so essentially when if the states want the federal government to take over enforcement or regulation of something that they don't want to do on their own, or something that they feel would be better served on the national level, then they get together and they give that authority to the federal government by way of.
Well, remember, there's two ways. Remember, there's two ways to propose an amendment, either through Congress or states holding a convention. So if the states got together and said, hey, you know what? We want the federal government to have drug laws. So we're going to hold our own convention of states, propose the amendment, ratify it. Thanks, federal government, for taking this garbage off our hand. They could do that.
Okay.
But the thing is, the states have to be the authority to give it to them. The federal government can't just arbitrarily say, you know what? I think we'll take care of drug laws. And that's what's happened.
Okay. So why? Okay. Why do the states not stand up and say you can't do that? I mean, at what point, I mean, are we the people derelict in our duty of saying enough, we're not going to tolerate this? I mean, is that something that the Congress does, or is that something that the states do?
There have been those that have spoke up, said, hey, this is wrong, this is whatever. And usually the legal response is, oh, well, it's already done. Nobody stopped it. So it's constitutional. Seriously, that's usually the response. Sometimes what they'll do is they'll say, oh, it's implied in the Constitution as being constitutional because federal government taking care of it is for the general welfare, or the federal government taking care of it is necessary because drugs cross state lines. And so we're going to use the Commerce Clause, both of which are, by the way, bad arguments.
Mm-hmm.
But they'll use those to say it implies, and then everybody go, oh, okay, well, I guess it's constitutional, and then they'll stop fighting. And the problem is we've allowed it. They know how to twist the words, and they know how to get us to go, oh, okay, no problem, because they've convinced us that you have to be a lawyer to understand it. The moment you say, well, that's not what I see. Are you a lawyer? Well, no. Well, then you don't understand, so shut up. I mean, that's kind of the attitude.
Let me ask a philosophical question. How much of this has to do with the Senate standing up and saying, no, we can't, we're not going to let this happen because we're not going to allow this because the Senates are supposed to be the constituency of the states. And since that was neutered with the 17th Amendment, the states don't really have a say in the legislature because the Senate is just another essentially House of Representatives. It's a
right.
higher form of House of Representatives.
Exactly. Well, I think there's some validity in what you're saying. If the senators had been appointed by the state legislatures were paying closer attention, and the Senate could stop a lot of this, say, hey, you know what, we're not even going to vote on this. There's no authority. Kill the bill. We're not even going to, I think I see that as a very valid point. I think you might be onto something there. And the thing is, the more you get to know me, the more you realize how damaging the 17th Amendment is, because it totally eliminated the state's voice from any lawmaking process and oversight over this federal government.
With respect, you can't alter. It's more difficult to alter an election at the state level than it is to alter a popular election.
Oh, absolutely. So, yeah, that's another thing. 2020 would have never happened if they were being appointed when it came to the senator elections. And the thing is, when it gets to the 17th Amendment, and we'll get more into this when we get there in the Constitution. But there, as I talked about last week, there are mechanisms. There is verbiage in the Constitution that basically tells us the 17th Amendment was illegally proposed, and that any state that didn't ratify it should not be required to follow it anyway. And I'm actually working on some projects to try to get attention going on that, including getting some legislatures, namely the Utah legislature first, to basically defy the 17th Amendment on purpose. Now, that said, that there's also a friend of mine who says, well, you know what? Delaware actually rescinded its ratification vote on the 17th Amendment back in, I think it was 2010 or 2008 or something like that. And his attitude is, if enough states were to rescind their votes, they can literally unratify it by rescinding their ratification votes, which I think is a very interesting concept. But, by Delaware rescinding it and being accepted that way, the federal government did accept that it no longer is a ratification vote. That is a precedent that set a precedent, so it could be followed theoretically to unratify the 17th Amendment. It's a very interesting argument to unratify it rather than just repeal it, but nonetheless, it can be done. So there's a lot of mechanisms in place. We got to get back to being a republic is what it comes down to. Indeed. And that's what that is. Now, when it comes back to supremacy, see, we've got this problem that everybody thinks the federal government is supreme over everything. Getting back to the drug laws. Well, they're the federal government. What they say goes. Well, not necessarily. They were created by the states. And I think I mentioned this last week, there's a wonderful letter from the Arizona Attorney General to Merrick Garland, the United States Attorney General. And the sentence in it that really I absolutely appreciate, and it says, the states created the federal government, not the other way around. And that's what I want the federal government to understand. Now, when we get into these discussions, though, immediately the horrors of the misbehaving states from the Confederate States of America and secession comes to mind. We can't allow the states to misbehave anymore. They can misbehave all they want. They're the ones that made this. If they don't like it, they can leave and secede. But if you don't give the states their authorities, this whole thing's going to fall apart. It's not going to work properly. you're going to wind up with a dictatorial government because the states couldn't stop it. We got to get the state's voice back in there. That is a mechanism that checks against federal tyranny. It really is. So the Constitution and the laws of the United States made in pursuance thereof of the Constitution are the supreme law of the land. Then there's a semicolon. What that does is that separates it but connects it. It connects it in the sense that the next thing is still a law of the land, but disconnects it that it will stand as a separate sentence. So therefore, the made in pursuance thereof does not apply. And this is really tough for a lot of people. This is a tough discussion I'm getting ready to have, but I want you to bear with me, understand the thinking, okay? So semicolon, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States. In other words, a treaty does not have to be following authorities granted by the Constitution. It's a treaty. Why would they do that? Why would they allow treaties? I mean, that would open the door for, say, using a treaty to get rid of our Second Amendment or something like that, right? Well, the thinking was there would be times that emergencies would call for actions that may go beyond what the Constitution allows, but the states, getting back to the 17th Amendment, through the Senate are the ones that ratify treaties. So if anybody should be able to make that decision that it's okay, it should be the states. And when it came to the Louisiana Purchase, this actually came in handy. Because, see, there's typically, according to Article 1, Section 8, the only way the federal government can own land or buy land or acquire land or property is by purchase through the consent of the state legislature for the purpose of needful buildings. Article 1, Section 8, I think it's Clause 17 or 18. Okay, so, but we have seen historically, we've also gained proper property through spoils of war. Treaty. A treaty also allows you to acquire property at the federal level. So either to acquire land, the federal government needs to purchase it through the consent of the state legislatures involved for the purpose of needful buildings, or it needs to be acquired through treaty. So here comes the Louisiana Purchase. Big deal, you know, and Thomas Jefferson is president. He's like, what a deal, man. It'll double the size of the United States. It'll get the French off our back to the west because they've been a problem in the past. Allow us to, really reach the coast, the West Coast as well with our territories. And the price is awesome because Napoleon's in the middle of a war. He just wants to unload the land because he needs the money real bad for his war. But Jefferson can't outright purchase it because, once again, Article 1, Section 8, purchase it with the consent of the legislatures for the purpose of needful buildings. In other words, the legislatures of the states are the ones that are really supposed to be purchasing property, territories, and things like that. But then he remembers treaties don't have to follow the Constitution, and land can be acquired through treaty, as we've seen in war. Therefore, he negotiated the entire sale of the Louisiana Purchase from France to the United States through treaty. Each step along the way was a new treaty, and then the state Senate would ratify it, and that would make that next step constitutional. Because remember, once a treaty is ratified, it becomes the supreme law of the land. And so the sale of, or the purchase, should I say, of the Louisiana Purchase was completely done through treaty, making it technically constitutional. Now, Thomas Jefferson didn't like monkeying with the Constitution like that. He actually wrote letters even later in life, late in his life, how he regretted using the Constitution in such a way. But it was the only way he could see of us purchasing that land. But nonetheless, this Constitution, laws of the United States made pursuant thereof, and all treaties made or shall be made, whether there's a constitutional authority or not, are the supreme law of the land. Now, if any of them conflict with each other, then that's going to cause a constitutional crisis. Then we'll have to have our courts or states or somebody decide which takes precedence. Because let's say a treaty is ratified and it says something that is against the Constitution, but the Constitution says otherwise, what do you go with? Because they're equally the law of the land. Now you got a crisis here. So it does create problems, but we'll see what happens if ever this pops up. But this once again goes back to why it's so important that the senators are appointed by the state legislatures, because they're the ones approving treaties. They're the ones ratifying treaties. Do we want a bunch of ideologues ratifying treaties, or do we want representatives from states that are worried about what's best for their state to be ratifying the treaties? It's a big deal, 17th Amendment. Any other questions from the chat or from you, Ron?
I don't see any. I don't see any. People are just chilling.
All right, very good. All right, then it says, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. In other words, a state cannot make something contrary to the Constitution. And now when I say that, I'm talking about constitutional authorities. I've had arguments with people, they say, well, then by having their gun laws, they're contradicting the Second Amendment. Well, not necessarily, because states have the authority to make some gun laws. The federal government can't make any gun laws. Shall not be infringed goes with the federal government. We'll talk about that probably next week in more detail. But now, what if a state does make a law that's contrary to the Constitution or to laws of the United States or a treaty? And that happened not too long ago. And the problem is the administration wanted it to happen. What I'm talking about is immigration. We have these immigration laws, and according to Article 1, Section 9, the federal government has authority over immigration. They can make immigration laws, they can enforce immigration laws, they can deport people. And then a bunch of states, including California, came up with this sanctuary state garbage. Except for the state of California doesn't have that same kind of authorities over immigration. It is a concurrent issue, but not like that. Let's go back and talk a little bit about law here so we can get back on the proper track here. Remember when Arizona had I think it was AB 120, I can't remember, but it was a Arizona law that basically mirrored the federal
1070.
What was it again?
1070.
Yeah, you remember things way too well. Yeah, see, I battle with CRS. Can't remember stuff.
Well, dude, you got to remember, I'm an Arizona resident.
Oh yes, you pay attention to that stuff. All right, like I pay attention to Kate Brown. But anyway, all right. So Arizona wrote this law, and it, for the most part, mirrored the federal law. And the only difference between the Arizona law and federal law is that the Arizona law did not allow the federal government to profile. The state government to profile. So the state law disallowed profiling. Other than that, it completely mirrored the federal law. And that was a completely constitutional law. The federal government sued Arizona over that law. And the argument was the Supremacy Clause. Holder's lawsuit, when he filed it, basically said that states were not allowed to have laws contrary to federal actions. So since the federal government refused to enforce immigration law, no state could enforce it because that would be contrary. And that's a bad argument. That's not what the Constitution says. It says that any laws contrary to federal law that is constitutional cannot be, is not valid. So the Arizona law was completely valid. It was not contrary. It mirrored and it helped with immigration. But the sanctuary state laws, they were contrary to the federal law. They were offering the opposite of what the law says. Therefore, they were unconstitutional. They violated the supremacy clause by being contrary. And someone says, well, Doug, gosh, I thought you were in a states' rights. I said, well, that depends on the authorities granted. The authority granted here when it comes to immigration doesn't allow the federal government to refuse, the states and the federal government to refuse to handle immigration. Immigration law is there for a reason. The authority exists for a reason. And the states were violating that. I don't mind if a state has states' rights, but not when it comes to a federal authority. They can't violate a federal authority like that. And when it comes to immigration, the way I like to explain it to help people understand, it's like a big schoolyard. And in the schoolyard, the principal has full authority. They have concurrent powers with the teachers, such as, excuse me, such as detention. Both the principal can issue a detention, and a student, a teacher can too to a student. Both can issue detentions, but for different reasons. So it's concurrent power. And if a child enters the schoolyard, and the principal's agencies, we'll call them security, notices this kid comes into the schoolyard that's not supposed to be there, then the principal's people can apprehend that person and then deport them from the schoolyard, remove them from the schoolyard. But what if that kid gets in unnoticed, gets into one of the classrooms where the teacher has authority over the classroom? The teacher has the authority to remove that child from their class, but they don't have the authority to remove them from the schoolyard. They still need help from the principal to get the kid off of the campus because the teacher's really supposed to be worrying about their class. Same thing here. So you've got a federal government whose job is to remove unwanted individuals that have not gone through the immigration protocol from the country. They can apprehend them, they can process them, they can deport them. When it comes to states, they have like authorities in the sense that they can work to remove them from their state, they can apprehend them, they can process them, but the actual deportation out of the country, that's got to be done by the federal government. That's the only authority that is not concurrent when it comes to immigration. So this is where it gets difficult. If the federal government's refusing to deport, how do the states handle the immigration issue? Do they detain these people indefinitely? What do they do? So it does create a crisis that the federal government right now is in the process of creating, because they're refusing to not only enforce immigration law, but they're refusing to deport. Now, that said, one of the other arguments is that sometimes the countries in which an illegal alien comes from will refuse to accept them when they're deported to that country. Well, I was talking to someone in the Border Patrol, and he said that's not as big of a problem as people think. Yeah, legally it's a problem. Legally, those countries don't want them. But that doesn't stop the federal Border Patrol agent from doing something like marching the illegal alien to the turnstile, pushing them through into Mexico, locking the turnstile, and the Mexican consulate's waiting for them on the other side. Or flying over Honduras in a helicopter and pulling a Vietnam move and pushing them out of the helicopter. That does, believe it or not, that does happen. I've talked to these border people about this. But technically we're supposed to, work with the other governments. But yeah, there are certain people where we just got to get them out of our country, and they actually do that. But anyway, all right. Any questions or comments before I go on?
So Colt is asking something about me. Go over here. So wouldn't it be like Newsom making deals with the Communist Chinese Party? Newsom was giving land to the CCP, and I looked that up. I couldn't find anything. The closest thing I could find was when Newsom did an executive order here in California to conserve like 30% of the land and water back last October. But then he also just says, speaking of immigration, I know California uses something Justice Scalise said to justify them making the 2 immigration laws that Doug mentioned. What's the deal? Now, I don't know if you understand what I just wrote.
Yeah, I don't recall anything that validated California's sanctuary state laws. I don't, whether or not a judge has come to that conclusion, that's a different discussion, but I haven't come to that conclusion. There's nothing that justifies it. Now, that said, what he was saying about Newsom making deals with like Chinese government, that isn't the supremacy clause in Article 6. That would go back to Article 1, Section 10, where it says that, let's see, no state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation. So they're not supposed to be, having an agreement with other countries or things like that. There's also another part. There's another section here too where it says something similar. Oh, here we go.
So I have a question for you, and I don't know if this is related or if I'm
Okay,
going
go
off
ahead.
in the weeds. But if a state wants to make a deal with a foreign country, are they supposed to get approval from the federal government beforehand?
Yeah, they have to have approval from Congress for any merchant deal. So anything that has to do with commerce has to go through the federal government, because federal government is in charge of import and export.
Okay.
So they cannot operate making deals without federal approval on that. And they cannot go into any alliance or confederation with any other state or with another country, any deals like that. So if Newsom is making any deals with, say, communist China, and he's doing it in defiance, in other words, he's not getting any congressional approval, then he's acted illegally. But that's Article 1, Section 10, and there's another section. I'm off the top of my head, I can't place where it's at, but Article Section 10 would be the main one on that. So it's outside federal supremacy clause, but it's definitely a good question. All right, let's continue. Then it says the senators and representatives before mentioned, and the members of the several state legislatures, and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and of the several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution. What's interesting about that, when I did research on this recently, I was finding how there had been a long discussion during the convention over that. There was a lot of people who didn't feel that being bound by oath or affirmation was necessary, because we're all Christians here. We all get along. We're all going to do the right thing. And they didn't think that, taking an oath to a document was wise. And the response was, if people don't take an oath, they're going to do whatever they want. We need to have that oath. There has to be an oath that you swear to God that you're going to uphold this Constitution, because you may think everybody gets along just fine. You may think everybody's good people or whatever, but ultimately we're dealing with human nature here. And the least we can do is at least demand that they have an oath. Now you'll notice it says oath or affirmation. What's the difference? An oath is to God. An affirmation is not to God. You affirm. So there was some religious Christian sects, that's SECTS, not the other sects. It's hard to pronounce them differently without getting into trouble here. That believe that it was sinful to swear to God. Then, of course, there's also those who don't believe in God. So why should they have to give that oath? So they did leave it open also for affirmation. Now, the next part is very interesting. It says, but no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. So in order to hold office, there is no religious test. In other words, you don't have to be Christian. You don't have to not be Christian. You don't have to be Catholic. You don't have to be Baptist. You just have to give your oath or affirmation to the Constitution. They can't give you a religious test. They can't expect you to. There's no established church in America. Now, it was interesting because I remember back, and I can't remember the name of this guy now off the top of my head, Khan, I think it was something Khan. And he was speaking at a Democratic National Convention. He holds up Constitution, and he was arguing against Trump's order not to allow Muslims into the country, which really wasn't an order had anything to do with Muslims. That's beside the point. This is what Khan was saying. And he said, it says right there in the Constitution, I've read it, that there should be no religious tests. You can't have a religious test for people coming into the country. It's not what it says. The only place religious test is listed is in Article 6 here. And it says that there should be no religious test for holding office. If we want to keep somebody out of the country for a religious reason, we can do that. Religious test does not apply to that. And understand that Islam has been a problem since day one. Our first two international wars after the American Revolution were the Barbary Wars, with the Barbary pirates, the Muslims. Islam has been a thorn in America's side since day one. And if the United States wants to make laws disallowing people coming from countries who preach hate of the United States and sponsor terrorism, they can do that. There is no religious test regarding immigration. Okay.
Doug.
Yes, sir.
So
did I stir a nest?
No, I think I think we're still in the weeds with this, but I wanted some clarification on this. So John is asking that if what you said is true, does that mean that the PPE deal that Newsom did with China was unconstitutional or illegal or unconstitutional?
Yeah, it's illegal. Okay. I do not believe he got approval from Congress. So I would say from what I understand of it, it's illegal. I mean, I don't know all the deeper details, but from what I understand of it, it's illegal.
Okay. And then Don says, so the Biden when the Bidens did their deal, was it a violation of Article 1, Section 10? I'm guessing you're talking about with China and Ukraine. With Burisma and
when he was not a part of the government. Yeah, I would. Well,
no, I know he was vice president at the time, I believe.
Yeah, well, what he did though was a pro quo situation, which hey, you're not going to get this or that if you don't do this. So, from a constitutional point, it wasn't necessarily constitutional, but unconstitutional. But from a U.S. code point of view, it was definitely unlawful what he did. The federal government can negotiate terms; they can negotiate deals. But the question was that Burisma deal? If was it with the United States or was it with him? If it was with the United States, then it required senatorial approval. If it didn't get senatorial ratification, because all treaties have to be approved by the Senate, and in my opinion, any agreement with another government is a treaty. Mm-hmm. And requires senatorial approval. So I would say, from the lack of senatorial approval, it would be illegal.
Okay.
Yeah, no, basically, folks, in other words, what I'm saying is, I'm going to confirm to you that they were criminals in the first place. You're right. They're a bunch of criminals.
I think that goes without saying.
It's funny because when I'm on with Scott, the moment I start using criminals, he starts grinning. He's like, hey, I've been saying that all along. They're a bunch of criminals. They're a bunch of forking criminals.
So Don clarified. He says he was referring to Hunter's deal, and if that's the case, then yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that once again, that's using Daddy's.
Well, no, I think that was Daddy using Hunter, but I don't think Hunter had anything to do with that deal. That was definitely a Daddy thing, using Hunter for.
And I would say that's a violation of U.S. code for sure. All right, Article 7. Ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this constitution between the states, so ratifying the same. 2 things here. Number 1, the Articles of Confederation required unanimous approval, which meant that nothing ever got approved because Rhode Island was usually voting against it. And when Rhode Island wasn't, it was South Carolina or Georgia. This requires 3/4. So in this case, 9. Number 2, because of its approval, what it's showing us is that it's a contract. It is a social contract between the states agreeing to this compact here called the U.S. Constitution. So therefore, it doesn't fall under any other type of law, common law or whatever. It falls under contract law. And under contract law, it comes down to this. Either it's in there or it's not. Either the federal government has the authority or it's not there. That's it. It's a contract. It falls under contract law. And also under contract law, the other thing that's important about contract law is anytime there is a discrepancy over what is intended or understood by the contract, in order to define what is meant by the contract, you go back to the original negotiations. The courts will tell you that. If you and I, Ron, had a contract and I decide to use a clause against you and you say, well, that's not what we meant, the judge could then ask for the minutes of our negotiation to determine what was meant, because the original intent from those minutes is what would be important. Why is it not the same with our Constitution if it's a contract? It's a social contract, and if there's any dispute over the definitions, then we need to go back to the original negotiations to figure that out. The original negotiations are not only the Constitutional Convention, but also the ratifying conventions. There was 13 of them, of each of the states ratifying, where questions were asked and answered, and the negotiations to make sure it was understood went on. And that's where I got my information from what I teach. But we're being told, no, that didn't matter. What a bunch of judges think it means is what matters. Well, then they're not following contract law, they're following common law.
Okay, so Cole put up a quote from Scalise. The federal government may neither issue directives requiring the states to address particular problems, nor command the state's officers or those of the political subdivisions to administer or enforce a federal regulatory program. Such commands are fundamentally incompatible with our constitutional system of dual sovereignty. And he says, he's saying what Justice Scalise said may be what California is using to justify its immigration stuff.
While the federal government is not supposed to direct to a state, in other words, we're the states are the parents, they direct the federal government, not vice versa. And they may be using that when it comes to what's that called? Sanctuary state. It doesn't matter. The fact is that the sanctuary state law is still contrary to the Constitution, and we should have the courts ruling in that manner, and the state should cease and desist on any of those laws. Now, that said, the problem is we then say, oh, well, gosh, the federal government's got to do something. Well, what about us? Why aren't we doing something? And some of us did. Cities were opting out of the sanctuary state, if you remember. And there was a big movement through the state, and a bunch of cities did it. That's how we do it. Because we can't sit here depending on the federal government saying, oh gosh, we need the federal government to stop the state from doing something. What about us? One of my biggest frustrations is that people forget that we're the ones supposed to be in control of this turkey. And more often than not, we don't do what we're supposed to be doing. We're not involved. We're not stopping the state from doing whatever they're doing. And also removing the people. It's the reason why I'm jazzed about this push to recall Newsom, because it's the people saying we're not going to put up with this crap. He's gone. They need to know that we have a voice. They need to know we can remove them. They need to know we can change what they're putting on there. Now, that said, we can change. Unfortunately, then the federal courts get involved, and then suddenly the states are okay with the federal government dictating. It's hilarious. But we do need to voice our voice. We need to be involved, because this idea that the federal government is going to fight for us against the state is ridiculous.
No. It's about a quarter till. Are you done with
I was going to finish the ratification.
Okay, go ahead.
All right, so ratification of the constitutions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this constitution between the states. Remember, it's a contract between the states. So ratifying the same, done in convention by the unanimous consent of the states present. 12 states were present. Rhode Island was not present. The 17th day of September. Why isn't September 17th a federal holiday? September 17th is Constitution Day. It should be a federal holiday. Get rid of Labor Day. Get rid of this other Juneteenth garbage has created, and instead make September 17th, Constitution Day, a federal holiday. That's my opinion. 17th day of September in the year of our Lord 1787, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 12th, in witness whereof we have hereunto submitted our names. Now, when you look at the list of those who signed it, number one, you'll notice that Rhode Island's not present. Number two, you'll notice that there's only one name under New York, Alexander Hamilton. The other two delegates threw their hands up and walked out. Robert Yates and, I can't remember the name of the other guy now off the top of my head. But anyway, they both became big-time anti-federalists. Then you notice there is one signature that did not represent a state.
George Washington.
No, but he actually represented Virginia and represented the presidency of the Constitutional Convention. No, I'm talking about William Jackson, the secretary.
Mm.
And what's funny is Madison took incredible notes during the Constitutional Convention. But even as good as his notes were, after he read the notes that Jackson took, Madison made some notations to correct his own or to update his own notes. So Madison's notes are not, when you read Madison's notes, they're not his notes originally. He did do some additions based on Jackson's notes, which I think is kind of funny. But anyway, so that's the first 7 articles. And next week, we'll get into the preamble of the Bill of Rights and into the Bill of Rights. All right. Any other questions?
I was going to say, since we're on the end here, why don't you talk? I know we're not really under the 16th and the 17th Amendments, but why don't you talk a little bit about why those two amendments are just conceptually, why those two amendments are so horrible on our current situation from a constitutional standpoint, and how they took us down a really, really bad road.
Well, you hear me say this all the time. Our biggest problem is democracy.
Yes.
And I remember one time the New York Times had this headline that said that Donald Trump is ruining our democracy. And my response was, I hope so.
Yes.
Because part of what made this country work so well is that we're not a pure democracy. We're not an aristocracy. We're not a monarchy. We're none of those things purely. What we are is we're a combination of a whole bunch of different ideas to make sure that none of them dominate, including democracy. So while we do have democratic principles in our system, for example, the people democratically vote for the members of the House and always have.
Would it be an accurate statement to say that we are a democracy on 2 days a year during election day?
Well, unfortunately, we've become more of a democracy all the time. But
you understand.
We are a republic.
The
way I like to explain it is we are a republic that has some democratic provisions.
But you understand my question about.
Yeah, no, I understand your question, but we shouldn't be a pure democracy even those 2 days a year, because the senatorial and presidential election is not supposed to be democratic. So we're even supposed to be a republic on those days. The only elections originally that was by the people was House of Representatives, your state assembly or state House of Representatives, your governor, your county supervisors, and your city councils. That's the only democratic vote in our system. All the other votes are supposed to be either through appointments or other means, so that other parts of government also have a check in there and a voice. For example, 17th Amendment, as we've talked about, the senators are not supposed to be voted in by the people as they are now, supposed to be appointed by the state legislatures. But you also asked about the 16th Amendment. The 16th Amendment's a big one, and a lot of people don't realize how big it really is. First of all, the Constitution warns against direct taxation. Jefferson said that if the government was ever able to directly tax, there would be no limit to how much they tax. Originally, the federal budget was paid for through tariffs and the states paying the tax. And the
Right.
states paid the tax based on the enumeration of the census. And you'll
Right.
see that in the 16th Amendment and in Article 1, Section 10, or I'm sorry, Article 1, Section 9, where it says that there shall be no capitation or other direct taxes laid unless in line with the enumeration of the census. And here's why it says that. The way it used to be prior to the 16th Amendment was the states paid for the federal budget. And California's population right now is 12% of the total population. So if we were on the old rules, California would pay 12% of the budget. Might be a reason for them not to want illegal aliens. But anyway, beside the point. So because it's the state legislature that is paying for this budget, not the people individually, guess what the state legislatures did? They looked over the budget. They went over it line by line. And if there was anything in there they didn't like, they would send it back and say, try again. We're not paying for this crap.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a real problem for the federal government during the progressive era in the late 1800s, early 1900s, because the states kept sending the budgets back. And they couldn't get their stuff paid for because they weren't willing to take out certain things. States like, I'm not going to pay for that. Let's take it out. And that was a mechanism to protect us against federal spending outside the Constitution, to allow the states to stop them from doing it. When we changed that with the 16th Amendment, that voice by the states, that oversight over the budget that the states had, was gone. Now they directly tax us. And back in, 2007, I think it was, a friend of mine, he went by Loki, Tim Curlin. He and I went over the entire federal budget. And we separated into two piles, every expenditure by the federal government, into unconstitutional or constitutional. There was no gray area. There was no what's kind of this, kind of that. It was either it was unconstitutional or it was constitutional. The unconstitutional pile was 87% of the federal budget.
Wow.
Before 1900, the unconstitutional spending by the federal government was less than 5%. Right now, our federal spending, according to GDP, or at least the last time I looked, it was like 28% or 24%. In the 1890s, the federal spending as compared to the GDP, the gross domestic product, was between 3 and 4%. Once they were able to get the states out of the way from being a mediator, they began to spend out the Yahoo. Now, what that does is that puts us into a very precarious situation because we can't stop them. Could you imagine if I, decided, you know what, since 85% of their spending is unconstitutional, I'm only going to pay 15% of my taxes. How long do you think before I'm in an orange jumpsuit? But see, if the states are mediators still, they'd say, whoa, 85%. I don't think so. Try again. The states being removed from their oversight over the federal government, and see, the blame goes to the federal, goes not only to federal supremacy and all these progressives, but goes to the war between the states. Because you'll hear people say, yeah, but Doug, the states misbehave, so we can't trust them. That doesn't mean that you remove all these mechanisms to let the federal government run wild.
You bring up, and I want to ask you a question. I asked you this the other day, but I want to get it on. I kind of stopped you. I know most people are under the impression that slavery was the main issue or one of the main issues for the war between the states, and I'm of the opinion that it certainly played a role, but I don't think it was, from a percentage standpoint, I don't believe that it was the dominating thing. It was there, but that was the, if you will, that was the issue that everybody had. That was the gun rights issue of the day. That was the one. That was the abortion issue of the day that everybody was emotionally tied to. So if you had to say, like, if you had to put things that caused the Civil War, where would you go? What would you say like would be number one, number two, and where would you rank slavery in that?
Slavery was a minor issue. If it was the reason for the war, when West Virginia separated from Virginia after Virginia seceded and they reapplied to the Union as a slave state, the Union would not have accepted West Virginia as a slave state back into the Union. At the beginning of the war, Tennessee, Kentucky, which were still considered part of the Union, but they were on the periphery, and West Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland were all slave states. Had the war been about slavery, those states would not have been allowed to be a part of the Union, first of all. So now let's talk about a ranking here. I'm not going through all of it, but I'm going to go through a handful at the top, and some people might be surprised. Reason number one, the biggest reason: state sovereignty, states' rights, state autonomy, all of that. The states were realizing the federal government was dictating to them what they could or couldn't do regarding certain issues, including slavery. But the number two reason is going to surprise you. I've been doing some significant research on this lately because I came across some of this information, which I knew it existed, and I knew this was one of the reasons, but I didn't realize how dominant of a reason it was. The bankers. Are you shocked?
No.
What had happened was, see, one of the things that caused the American Revolution was the bankers, actually, because America did something that countries shouldn't have done. We decided we're going to have our own currency outside the system. We created the Continentals, which was completely outside the system. It wasn't tied to any of the banking systems. And that was a no-no. And so there are some quotes that said that banking was the reason for the American Revolution. Was it the only reason? Absolutely not. Was it the dominant reason? It was up there. So when Alexander Hamilton got us on the back into the system with the Bank of the United States during the Washington presidency, all of the bankers and all of the powers were happy. Jefferson then allowed that charter for that bank to expire, but under pressure, sadly, Madison, and one of the few things I'm angry with Madison in history about, signed for the second charter, or the Bank of the United States, the second Bank of the United States. Andrew Jackson, while I typically think he's a bleeping son of a bleep, he had it right when it came to the banking system and national debt. He ran on getting rid of the Bank of the United States, getting us out of the European banking system, back to our own currency, separated from everybody. And he also campaigned on paying off the national debt, which he did for a whole 2 months. But he pulled it off. And so we were no longer in the banking system. We were not a part of it as of 1836.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So the Bank of the United States was gone. We're outside. We are running our own currency. We are regulating the value of our own currency. And the banking system of the world in Europe had no control over our currency whatsoever. And the bankers didn't like that. They were trying to push us back into it. But the states that were most against it, you want to take a guess?
The South.
The South. They were most against tying us to Europe. Also, they were wanting to work some deals individually with Europe. And the tariffs were high. The North, the North acted like they had all the power, but really the South had all the power, because the North could not produce anything without the South providing raw material. All the raw materials come from the South, and the North would manufacture it, then would go to Europe, and then the North got rich over it. And there was actually laws in place that disallowed the South from having manufacturing. So the South's like, hey, we want to have our own banking system. We want to do our own manufacturing. We want to make our own deals with European countries that want our products. And the North said no. And the bankers said, and we're going to pull America back into the banking system. And Lincoln supported that idea. So when the South finally said, you know what? Let's see. On all these issues, everything, slavery, banking, everything, the writing's on the wall. You're against us. We're out of here. especially once Abraham Lincoln got elected. So between the election of Abraham Lincoln and the inauguration of Lincoln, those states seceded. Most people don't realize that's when they seceded. So the America that Lincoln was elected to run and the America he was inaugurated to run were two different Americas. Those states were gone. And they believed that the federal government and the North had been violating and breaching the contract called the U.S. Constitution and forcing them into economic systems, forcing them into federal control that they did not like and did not believe in. Now, that said, Abraham Lincoln had been schooled by the law schools of the time that this isn't a voluntary union, it's a firm union. You should do everything you can to hold together the union. And so he did with a military invasion. I got a lot of family in Arkansas, and the folks in Arkansas, they don't call it the Civil War, and they don't call it the war between the states. You know what they call it? The War of Northern Aggression. Mm-hmm. Now, that said, I'm not going to go further into it.
Yeah.
Well, because I want to save the real thunder. Speaking of calling down the thunder, I want to talk about the real thunder when we get to 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, and then I will blow some heads up.
Nice. Well, that being said,
that was a nice teaser for the 13th, 14th Amendment.
I thought so too. But let me touch on what you talked about. Before the Federal Reserve Act and the implementation of it, the U.S. Treasury, we had a surplus of over $5 billion in 1920. $5 billion in 1920. And that's in 1920, that's in 1920 dollars. So, and now look where we are with the Federal Reserve and what they did with money.
Well, the Federal Reserve caused the Great Depression.
100% they did. They flooded the money. They flooded everything they flooded the country with a whole bunch of money. The first thing their first order of business was to kill all the small banks, and that was what they did. And then they could have fixed the depression, but they didn't. They did many things that actually furthered it. But anyway, I digress. It's we could go down this rabbit hole for hours. But thank you everybody for putting up with us today. And I'm sorry we were gone last week, but
I feel like I'm losing my voice here at the end, so I'm almost glad the hour is up. But I'll be ready to roll much better next week, I promise.
Yeah, you sound we're gonna get you off of here, Doug. So thanks everybody for being with us, and we will see you next week, 3 p.m. Pacific.